Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of our Azure Administrator Study Series. I hope you guys have the wonderful weekend and also a wonderful day today. Today is another beautiful day, and Sir David have something incredible for us as always.
Yeah.
So, Sir David, what do you have in store for us today?
Hey, hello. How you doing? How's it going?
Yeah, I'm
How's
doing quite well.
the day?
I hope you had a wonderful day.
I'm still recovering from the jollof from the that we had. So I went to visit Sakofi and his wife and his lovely son yesterday.
Yeah, yeah.
Not yesterday. That was like sorry on
On,
Friday.
on Friday.
Yeah, and I will still have like with myself and my wife. We had jollof rice that we're still recovering from that jollof, and you know, it's just been different.
Yeah, I'm
it's,
glad that you did
it's
enjoy the food. Yeah.
it's a different life now. I see like the lifestyle of the rich. I understand like the different stuff. I was like, I've been eating jollof rice. This one is different. The sort of ingredients that you put is different. Where the normal where the normal guy just puts jollof and doesn't put stuff. Sakofi had like all this, salad and all this like extra meat and everything. And then there
Extra
was like
meat.
this stew that was different. It's like, oh, okay.
Well, you know how it is. We actually knew that Oga David is coming, so we have to make it look really nice and presentable.
Yeah, it was absolutely awesome. It was absolutely awesome. Sakofi, what's going on, man? Crypto.
Yeah, I mean, it's just another day of the crypto market. You know how it is. It's roller coaster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good one. Good one. Yeah.
So if you have your
But
money stuck in there, you have to keep holding it.
yeah, I'm not even sure like holding it. But yeah, you know what? You're right. You probably just hold it. Eventually, it probably go up again.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Sakofi, yes, what we're going to be doing today actually is a very interesting one. So there's a special thing happening tomorrow in relation with the certification that we're looking at. And here's the special thing that's going on tomorrow. So on Sakofi. So let me go ahead and bring up the AZ104, the Azure certification path that we've been following for the Azure Administrator exam objectives. So if you have a look at this, can you see this, Kofi?
Yeah. So it looks like there's an update coming up tomorrow.
Tomorrow, exactly. So tomorrow, there'll be an update of the content of this particular exam. But guess what? What we're currently going to already covers the updates that will be coming in from tomorrow. So you'll be well covered, right? If you're just following like the
Prepare.
content that we're going to, we've already taken that into consideration in terms of the update coming tomorrow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down a little bit and I'm going to go to the exam objectives, and I'm going to just show you very quickly like some of the changes that they've made. So you can see here it says the exam guide below shows the changes that will be implemented, right?
Yeah.
So you can see there's something about administrative unit. We'll talk about that later. So any changes that will be coming with regards to what we are discussing today, as you can see, there's no new changes coming in that aspect. So we're going to be good. So we're going to be covering the aspect of compute today. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. But the main changes that's happening is around the issue of networking. They are changing this objective to looking at monitoring for Azure networking instead of performance focused. They're including administrative units, and because storage tiers now covers Azure files also, so they removed the specification for Azure Blob. So storage tiers now it's applicable for Azure files. And what else is changing? And that's it. So there's very little changes that's coming, but there will be changes that will be implemented from tomorrow.
Wow.
Yeah. So a lot of stuff for us to do and for us to look forward to. So here's the FinTech coffee that we're going to start with today. So we're going to start looking at compute objectives today. And here's what we're going to try to cover. We're going to just do a quick overview of Azure Virtual Machines. So just quick overview of that. And now we're going to start looking at the component of Azure Virtual Machines. We're going to look at the components of Azure Virtual Machines images. And again, you're going to learn some very important thing here. So stick with us. You're going to learn some very important things. We're going to talk about Azure Virtual Machine disks. And disks, oh, let's spell that correctly. We're going to talk about Azure VM high availability. We're going to talk about, let's see, there's a few other things that we're going to cover. Let's quickly bring up the objectives and let's see what we're looking to cover. So we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about sizes. So we're going to talk about Azure VM sizes. Oh, come on. Let's do that again. Let's go to clear that out. So we'll talk about Azure Virtual Machine sizes. And finally, we'll talk about virtual machine skill sets. So essentially, this lines up with the exam objectives.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah. So you see, if I go to bring up the exam objectives again, I'll make that bigger for people to see. If I go under the Azure Compute scenario, you see that this lines up with that, right? So
Yeah.
this lines up with what we're going to be covering. And we're going to be covering some of these topics very, very quickly. So here's the first thing that we're going to look to see, Sarkofi. So Sarkofi, you can help us to explain this. You've been in the tech industry for a while. So virtual machines. Are virtual machines, first of all, are virtual machines still relevant in the days of cloud native? So we hear a lot about cloud native these days, right? Do we still need to learn about virtual machines? Are they still relevant? Are virtual machines going to disappear in a few days? Are we all going to be using serverless? Can you help us to answer this question, Sarkofi?
Well, I mean, virtual machines, I think it's still going to be there for quite some time. I know nowadays there is a lot of talks about containers, which simplify everything. But I think now people are now moving all their service to the cloud. And one of the things that people probably they tend to do is that they probably will try to move to, for example, like for like. So what they have on the on-prem environment is all, sometimes they have virtual environment whereby they're using, let's say, VMware, right, or another hypervisor. So moving to the cloud, and then you can use, let's say, the Azure migration to do your calculation to understand the cost. More likely, they want to move to a service that is quite kind of similar to what they have, so that for in terms of learning, it will be much easier for them to understand those concepts. So it will still be there, but I think in terms of future wise, I mean, that is going to be a bit harder, because what the container does seems to be creating a huge advantage when it comes to the future proving your environment. So, but still, I think I've not really used the container that massively. Since you use it massively, probably you'll be the right person to answer that. I'm not sure. I know with the container, you can use to deploy websites and other microservices, but are there any limitation that will still keep, let's say, VM lurking around or something?
And that's a very good point, because if I understand what you're saying correctly, Sarkofi, what you're saying is that virtual machines, even in the days of cloud native, that we hear a lot about cloud native, virtual machines are not going away. Number one, because from what you described is that it makes it easier for organizations to adopt the cloud quicker.
That's right.
So because they're already deploying their applications on virtual machines on premises, and it's much more easier to lift that and shift that into the cloud versus trying to go full cloud native, like doing serverless computing and doing containerization, which essentially is going to require more effort from them.
That's
So is
right.
that what you were explaining? That's what.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Yeah. And it's sort of very interesting. And that's a very, very great point, Sarkofi. And that's the truth, right? Virtual machines are not going to be going away for quite a while, right? There's a lot of reasons for that, right? Another good reason for that is that there are some applications that you should not run them on containers, right? Containers they much more benefit a microservices architecture, where your application components are broken into smaller pieces, not a monolithic architecture. Can you run monolithic architectures on containers? Sure, you can do that, right? Is that the use case that it was designed for? No. Can you drive a truck to go buy your grocery shopping in Hazda down the street? Yes. Is that the use case of the truck? No. So
That's a
it's
very
sort of
good
like
one.
yeah, it's sort of like that approach, right? So it's
Yeah.
sort of like eventually what we're going to end up with, Sakofi, what I think is that we're going to end up with like there's going to be a range of compute options for cloud computing. And that is where many organizations will end up with. So we're going to have a range of compute options.
Yeah.
So let's go back. And the range of compute options will range all the way from virtual machines that we're talking about today.
Yeah.
And it's going to have virtual machines. And then we're going to have,
Serverless,
serverless. Yeah. And we're going to have
containers.
serverless functions. And we're going to have containers. And apart from serverless and that, we're also going to have managed platform services.
Yeah.
So actually, I'll put that before serverless. So I'll just say managed platform services. And I think that this is what we'll essentially have and what we'll carry on with, which essentially we mean an organization can sort of choose and say,
Exactly.
it makes sense for my application to run this way, therefore I
Yeah.
will run it this way.
I think even with a cloud, that's one of the goals. The choice is yours. You decide what you want to go. Because, I mean, it's not about. I mean, obviously, when you're deploying something, you're thinking about the cost. But still, when you're deploying something, fit for purpose also applies as well.
Yeah.
So wherever you're trying to deploy, you need to consider. I think about a few weeks ago, I was trying to deploy. Or just trying to set up a test environment on AWS, right?
Yeah.
And I wanted to set it up in a way that I can actually deploy a hypervisor, right? Then I realized that there is a limitation. I need a specific VM, the M series, which I believe is the hardware series, which will allow me to have the hypervisor. So essentially, there are certain things that will be lacking in other services, but will be more available in other services as well. So the choice is yours, depending on what you want to use. You need to consider what is fit for your deployment.
Awesome. And I agree with that, Sakofi. So in terms of Azure Virtual Machines, what we're going to start with is just a quick overview of Azure Virtual Machines. And this is very simple. The question is, are virtual machines in Azure the same as virtual machines in on-premises environment? So that's the question that we want to answer under this section. Virtual machines in Azure, are they the same or are they different from virtual machines on premises? The answer to that is yes and no. So yes and no. A virtual machine in Azure is the same as virtual machine on premises. At the same time, it's not the same. So what do you mean by that, David? For example, if you're familiar with VMware and Hyper-V and all the other points, when you're creating your virtual machines, you have the option to specify the amount of CPU and the amount of memory that you want, right? So that choice is up to you. You can say, I'm going to be creating a virtual machine and I want this. Well, in Azure, it's not the same because in Azure, when you're adding a virtual machine, you have to select from predefined sizes, right? So it's not as if you can pick, you can pick whatever size you want, but the sizes are predefined. You don't create your own size by yourself like you would do on premises, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So for example, if I'm creating a virtual machine in Azure, let's go put this in a resource group. So I'll go ahead and create a new resource group. I'll call this compute RG. And I'm going to say this is my dev VM01. And I'm going to leave that in the East US region. We'll talk about this later. When I get to the sizes, you see that if I go to see all the sizes, you'll see that I have to select a predefined size. I cannot say I want 1 CPU and 2 gigs of RAM. If that's not a predefined option, I don't have that option.
All right.
So Microsoft already predefined the option for me. But otherwise, and the other thing to note about virtual machines in Azure is that it only supports 2 operating system types. It supports Windows and Linux, right? So we cannot run Unix or any other one. You cannot run Mac. So essentially, So we're talking about predefined sizes. And then operating system that are supported is Windows and Linux only. So no other operating system currently supported. So it's the same, yet there's a little bit of difference in terms of how it works in the cloud.
So with Windows, is there any specific Windows version that we can have on the in the cloud
Very
on
good question.
Azure?
Yeah, I believe that from Windows Server 2008 out to and above is what it supports.
Okay.
In terms of that. So essentially, anyone that's reasonable use case in terms of, as long as it's not Windows Server 2003 or any of that
Yeah.
stuff, you'll be able to run 2008 out to and above on it.
And the same apply for Linux as well then.
So Linux, because Linux has many distributions.
Yeah.
So it's the truth that you can run essentially any Linux distribution on Azure. So they support the official ones like your SUSE Linux, your Red Hat Linux, your CentOS, and the other stuff. So they support a lot of that. But at the same time, customers can also have their own like modified, customized Linux. The main thing that matters is so it's sort of like the drivers that it supports. So there are certain
Okay.
drivers that are needed. And then the other thing is that your Linux must be able to run what is called the Microsoft Azure agent. So there is an agent that has to be installed on every virtual machine in Azure. It's called the Windows Azure agent. So Windows Azure agent. And there's the agent. It's available for Linux. It's available for Windows Azure agent, Linux. So it's called WA agent. So if you run any virtual machine in Azure, so actually I have a virtual machine currently running in Azure. So I was using it for some development stuff earlier. So let me bring that up here. So this virtual machine is running in Azure. If I go under the task manager and I go under more details and I go under details, one of the services that you see that's running on this virtual machine is a service called Windows. Can you see that service there? I know that it's a bit
Yeah.
small. Yeah, but that's a service that's called Windows Azure Guest Agent.
So what is that for? Is it for grabbing information like the resource utilization so that it will be sent to the Azure environment? Or what is that one for?
A very, very good question, Sir Coffee. So the agent, what our agent is used for, it's used for communication between your virtual machine and the Azure platform. Is what that helps to do. So I'll show you what that means, for example. So for example, if I go to my Azure environment over here where I have my virtual machine, I'll bring that up to the portal. I'll bring that up on the screen in a minute. I have my Azure environment over here. If I go ahead, let's go ahead and close that. If I go on the virtual machines and under virtual machine, so this virtual machine that I currently have running in Azure is this one, this dev VM01. If I click on that virtual machine and I go on the left-hand side, you see that I can do things like set the virtual machine password. So if I scroll down over here, you see that I can go reset password, right?
Yeah.
I can say get me boot diagnostics. I can say shut down. If I say stop this virtual machine, it's not just going to stop power it off. It's actually going to do a graceful shutdown. And it's going to trigger a normal graceful shutdown. So what's linking the communication between the platform and my virtual machine is that agent.
Agent, right.
Yeah. So, that agent has to run on every Azure virtual machine, including Linux virtual machines. So that's what matters. Can your Linux, can it run this agent? Is the thing that matters.
That's right.
So, and you can see here that the agent does a lot of things. So it's, configures authentication. So essentially it goes through like what the agent does and everything that it does. So it does a lot of things, but essentially it's communication between the agent and the platform. So I can see that we have some questions already, or some comments and questions.
Let me just bring this up. Let me just bring this up here.
Yeah.
All right. So you say if you are to consult for companies, which of the compute options will you advise them to go for? So I think this one depends on what sort of what they're going to use the compute for, I believe.
Mhm.
So if it's for graphics related stuff, then you have to select that specific one. If it's for compute or analyzing data, then there are special machines that are very good in terms of the CPU.
Yeah.
So I think it all depends on that specific company what they need the computers for,
Yeah, I
the
agree with
VM for.
Sakofi. I agree with Sakofi. And the way to do that, Okoyemi, is that if you look at Microsoft recommendation and follow that, what do I mean by look at Microsoft recommendation and follow that? So, for example, I'm about to select a VM size here. If I go over here to click on learn about VM sizes, you see that Microsoft has predefined certain virtual machine sizes for certain use cases, like what Sakofi was describing right now. So, for example, if I scroll down over here, you see that there are virtual machines that are classified as general purpose. And if you go under that category, you see Microsoft describes what this virtual machine type is good for. So, for example, they said if you want to do, okay, why is he going up and down? Let's do that again. So, for example, they mentioned over here, they said if you're planning to do testing, if you're planning to do small to medium databases, low to medium traffic web servers, general purpose virtual machine sizes is ideal for you. So
Yeah.
Microsoft has done their test and they're saying that this virtual machine size is optimized for this use case. If I scroll down, if I go to compute and I go to overview, so under overview section, it says if you so this is a compute optimized categories. It says if you want to run medium traffic web servers, network appliances like your software firewalls, batch processes, application servers, then you use these categories of virtual machine because they are optimized for that use case. So that's the answer to your question, Okoyemi. Follow this documentation in terms of what Microsoft recommends for different use cases, right? And pick a virtual machine under this category if your workload is consistent with what they describe. So hopefully that makes sense to you.
Yeah. All right, let me bring up the next question. Right. So talking about virtual machine sizes, are there restrictions on the number of VMs of a particular that one can deploy in a particular region before one will have to change to another region?
Good question, Michael. So it's not necessarily on virtual machine sizes. There's a restriction on the number of CPUs. So that's how it works. So there are certain virtual machine sizes that will be restricted if you're using a free account, for example. But this restriction is more about the number of CPUs that you can use. So, for example, I have my subscription over here. If I go over to my subscription and on the left hand side, if I go to select subscriptions, what you see is that if I go ahead and select my subscription, it's going to let me know what the quota limits are for different services. So if I scroll down under my subscription and I go to usage plus quotas, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show the quota for not just resources that I'm using, I'm going to show the quota for Microsoft.compute. So I'm going to specify Microsoft.compute there and I'm going to see that. So what you see here is, let me go ahead and make that a bit smaller so it's going to show much more clearly. And if I go to Microsoft.compute and if I go to the service and I select just virtual machines, actually you can see you can select different virtual machine categories. So if I select like some of these virtual machine categories, it's going to let me know the limitation. And what you notice is that it's limiting me to 10 CPUs per region. So you can see over here, it says if I'm using this family, I can only have 10 CPUs of this family, 10 CPUs of that family. So essentially, Michael, to answer your question, you may have to switch between different virtual machine types, right? If you hit the 10 CPU limit, or you may have to switch to a different region. So that's the way to do that.
Okay,
Uh,
so just to add on to this one, is there any limit to how many VMs you can deploy in a specific region?
so it's not necessarily like with the VM, it's about the CPUs.
Okay.
Is the thing. So there's no limit. Like, so for example, it's like, okay, you want to deploy 500 this one, that's fine, as long as you
Mm,
don't get to your CPU limit. So that's
okay.
what matters. However, if you're running this in production, of course, you can always request from Microsoft support and they can raise that limit for you. Right? If you're running something in production and you're like, okay, I really need this virtual machine size and I need a lot of them to be able to run my production environment. Of course, Microsoft wants your business. So raise a support call so you can just go request increase right here. So
Yeah.
raise a support call with Microsoft. They will increase your CPU limit for that particular size of virtual machine that you're looking to use. Okay. So we'll come back to your question, David. So hopefully that
Yeah.
makes sense. So here's a very quick one because we're talking about virtual machine sizes here. So let's see where we are. So let's go back here. So we've talked about this. So let's move this around a bit. So right now, because we've talked about virtual machine overview, and right now we're talking about virtual machine sizes. So we're already automatically talking about this. So we can talk about this after. So in terms of virtual machine sizes, Kofi, the name of a virtual machine size has significant meaning to it. What do you mean by that, David? So, for example, when I was creating a virtual machine earlier, you see that when I was selecting the size of the virtual machine that I wanted to create, it was asking me and it said, David, can you specify the size that you want? And the different sizes that it gave to me, you notice that they have like a naming scheme. So if I go ahead and see all the sizes here, so for example, you notice that some sizes have S in their names, right? So
Yeah.
that is DS1, D2S, D2AS, B2S, D4S, and stuff. Does anyone know what the S means? Anyone in the chat window, what does the S mean? So when you see a virtual machine size in Azure and you see S in the name, what does that S stand for? Because you see some of them have S in their names, why some do not have S in their names. Why? What's like this one doesn't have S in the name. So what does that S stand for? Who can tell me that in the chat window? SSD. Well done, Aaron. That is exactly correct. So the S stands for premium SSD. What that means is if I select a virtual machine, so it stands for SSD. So if I select a virtual machine type that doesn't have S in the name, I can add premium SSD. That's the meaning. So for example, if I
Okay.
select this, look at this, Kofi. If I go ahead and select A2V2, right?
Yeah.
And I go to select that. If I go next to under disk, and I say I want to deploy premium SSD, it's going to say,
Yeah.
no, what are you trying to do, David? You selected a virtual machine that doesn't support premium SSD. No, you can use premium SSD here. So
Right.
that's why it's complaining. So that's what the S stands for. So
Got
who
it.
wants to do this again? So there's another one.
Okay, so
You
it doesn't stand for. It's not the same naming scheme as iPhone in some way, it's SSD, so it's speed. So
hold on, is that the meaning of S in iPhone S?
I mean, normally when they come up with they will come out. Let's say iPhone 6. The next version will be iPhone 6S.
Sakovi,
So
that's a revelation to me. I didn't know that S stands for SSD in iPhone S.
no, I'm just joking. I'm just saying it might be.
I'm not sure.
It's not.
I'm
It's
not
not.
sure. If anyone knows whether S stands for SSD in iPhone S, let me know.
No, it's not. It doesn't.
So that's the S. So what about the V? Does anyone know what the V stands for? What do you think? So anyone in the chat window, what do you think the V stands for? So S stands for premium SSD. What does the V stand for? Let's see. Let's see who is going to answer this question. Any thoughts? Come on, give it a go. Version. So you're
Version.
right. You're right, Okpayemi, but the question
Yeah.
is version of what? Right? It's a version of something. So Mohammed, you're right. Version, but version of what is the question? Version of what? Right? Is it a version of the power connector version of what? What is the version about? So I'll answer that question for you. So the V stands for
Version 2. Yeah, that's correct as well. So the previous one was version 1, and they upgraded something in there. It's now version 2, right?
I love this answer, Sakofi.
Yeah.
This is just version 2 of whatever that is. That's so interesting. So the V stands for the generation of the hardware, right? Because if you think about it, Sakofi, Azure is just like any other data center, right?
Yeah.
Only that it's advanced data center. Now, with any other data centers, you get hardware generation. So, like 5 years ago, you bought like new hardware kit into your data center. 3 years down the line, those kits are old.
That's right.
You
Yeah.
need to get rid of them. So you get in new hardware models that have faster processor, newer processor types, better memory, and all those sort of capabilities. And what you
Right.
want to do is you want to clean up out the old ones so that you have the new ones that are running. That's
That's
what the
right.
V stands for. So if you see a virtual machine size in Azure without a V, those are the version ones. Those are the legacy hardware generation. Then you have like the version 2, then you have the version 3, then you have the version 4, which are sort of like the latest ones now.
And one thing you have to bear in mind is that you have to look at the prices, right?
Yeah. And we'll talk about that in a minute with the prices of coffee. Because here's the thing. So, for example, I'm over here. You see that it's describing, if I go to the general purpose one and I go under overview, it's describing general purpose to me. And look at what it's going to say. It says general purpose, it says differences between them. And it's going to be telling us exactly what CPU they're using and other things. Let me show you an example very quickly. Let me go to the DV3 option. So not okay, yeah, actually this one. If you look at this Sarkophie, it says the DV2 option, which is the version 2 of the D series,
Yeah,
it says it has a more powerful CPU, right? It is 35% faster than the original D series. So this is a newer generation of hardware,
that's right. Yeah,
right? However, you see that it describes the processor that it has. However, you see that it doesn't mention anything about hyperthreading, right? Nothing
yeah,
about hyperthreading. If you go to the version 3 of the D series and you look at the description, you notice that it says, okay, these are newer, right? They have processors that support hyperthreading, which you don't get in version 2,
that's right.
right?
Yeah,
And then if you go to version 4, you see even more newer hardware, which has capabilities that you don't get in the previous version. So that's sort of like the way that that works. And also, finally, whenever you see A in the name of a virtual machine, whenever you see A in the name, the A also stands for something. Anyone knows what the A stands for? And then we'll move on. What does the A stand for? So the V stands for the hardware version. The S stands for premium SSD. What about the A? What does the A stand for? Anyone? 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 So I'm looking for very creative answers here, Sakofi. So what does the A stand for when we're looking at our virtual machines? So I can see any answers yet. People are still thinking. Oh, I can see someone said
movement.
development. So development doesn't sort of match with A. They don't match together. Any other thoughts? So I'll tell you what the A stands for. The A stands for, advanced rapid. It stands for AMD processors. So the ones without the A means that they are using Intel processors. The one with the A means they are using AMD processors, right? So if I go over here, if I go to like the DAV4, if I go to select that, um, you notice that these are running on AMD processors. They are not running on Intel processors. If I go for the DV4, the one without the A, you see that these are running on, once it shows, Intel processors.
All right.
So awesome. So now you're expert in deciphering Azure virtual machine sizes. So let's move on to other things that's much more important. So, anyways, so we got that down, so we understand virtual machine sizes. So Sarkovi brought up a point with regards to pricing. So just be aware, Microsoft wants us to move to the latest version of the hardware generation. They want us to get away from the legacy one, move towards the new one. How do you think Microsoft can encourage us, Sarkovi? How
Well,
can Microsoft encourage us?
it's all about the Benjamins, baby.
Exactly. So what they usually do is that when they release new generation sizes, they usually offer them at a cheaper price
Yeah.
than the legacy ones, so that way you are incentivized to move your virtual machines to newer sizes. So, for example, you have a look at this. Let me show you an example where you have like
And
the yeah.
and with that, right,
Mm.
at some point, if most customers are using the very latest, will Microsoft start to remove the older ones from here?
Exactly. And eventually they will get rid of them, whether people move or not. They will just force
Yeah,
you to move eventually, but they'll give you that space to move initially
that's right.
so that you can do your testing. So, for example, if you have a look at this, this is the version 2 of the DS2, right? And this is the version 3 of the DS2, right? You notice that between version 2 and version 3, they have an extra RAM, an extra gig of RAM. So this has two CPUs, 7 gigs of RAM. This has two CPUs, 8 gig of RAM, right? However, you notice that the price for this one is £52 per month. The price for the version 2, which has less RAM, is £79 per month. So that's like about more than £20 saving. So you calculate that if I have 1,000 virtual machine, that's 20,000 savings, right?
Yeah.
So, that's how they encourage us to do that. Okay, so let's move on quickly to the other things. So the other thing we wanted to talk about, so we've talked about virtual machine sizes. Let's talk about virtual machine images. With virtual machine images, we have three options that we can choose from. We can pick from marketplace images that are provided by Microsoft. We can pick from marketplace images that are provided by a third party. So let's expand this. So marketplace images provided by Microsoft, marketplace images provided by third party, and then custom images provided by the customer. This is where a customer brings their own images. So those are the three options that we have when it comes to virtual machine images. So when I'm creating a virtual machine, so I'll go ahead and select the size. I'll go ahead and click on select. You can see images. If I go to see all the images, it gives me the option. It takes me to the marketplace and it says select your image option. So we have images in the Azure Marketplace that are provided by Microsoft. So if you go to the publisher and filter for Microsoft, it's going to show you images in the Azure Marketplace provided by Microsoft. What you see is that some of them are just operating system only. Some of them are operating system bundled with application. So for example, this is Windows Server 2012 with SQL Server bundled with it, right? So you can see and by the way, when we say Microsoft provided images, we're not just talking about Windows because Microsoft provides images in the Azure Marketplace that are Linux. So for example, you have SQL Server on Red Hat Linux provided by Microsoft, right? So Microsoft loves Linux these days.
Yeah.
So they're a fan of Linux these days. So just be aware of that. So we have Microsoft provided images. But in some cases, you want to use a third-party software, right? That's not provided by Microsoft. In those cases, you can go to switch to partner, and then you can go get images that are provided by third-party partners. So that can be your software vendors. So they have, like your firewalls and all this other stuff. Like, yes, Ubuntu server provided by Canonical. So these are third-party publishers in the marketplace. Oh, here's one that looks interesting to me, Sakofi. Can you see with what I'm seeing?
Which one is it? Kelly.
Sakofi, can you see what I'm seeing? No, Sakofi,
Oh,
Kali. Which is about
Ethereum.
Kali?
All right. Oh, the blockchain.
I can see Ethereum there. We need some crypto going on, Sakofi.
Wow. You can do your mining here as well.
I'm not sure whether it's for mining. I'm almost sure that it's probably for other things. It says for blockchain development.
Yeah.
But maybe that's my way to become a millionaire like Sarkozy. I'll come back to Ethereum Studio later. I'll need to book my. I need to just let me click love on that. I'll come back to it later. Okay, so we have this, but we can also use our own images, Sakofi. So I can go build my own image, install the Windows Azure agent on it, as we mentioned. And if I've done that, if I go under my images, I'll see a list of the images that I've imported over here.
Right.
And then I'll be able to use that. So those are the options that we have. So we have Microsoft images provided by Microsoft, which could be operating systems or operating systems bundled with application, third-party images, which are usually bundled with applications, or images provided by the customer. One of my own favorite images is the Visual Studio one. So I use it a lot. So if I go to the marketplace image, so let's go to the marketplace. So browse the marketplace. Come on. Okay, let's just go to back. And let's go back one more. There we go. Come on. It's just taking me a step back. It was a bit slow to respond. Now it's responding all of a sudden. Okay, anyways, so let's go to switch that. So one of my own favorite images that I use a lot of is an image called Visual Studio Image in the Azure Marketplace. So this particular image has Sarkofit as Visual Studio already installed. It
Yeah.
has Visual Studio Code installed. It has Git already installed. It has Azure PowerShell already installed. So it has a lot of like development tools already installed.
Okay, so we got a question here. It said, what is an image, please? And what is a VM template? And what is it used for?
Very good question. So, what's an image? So, an image, it's just a snapshot of an operating system, right? So, it's just a snapshot of an operating system that you can use to create a new virtual machine. So that's the meaning of that. So, for example, somebody created the image for Visual Studio that I was talking about. So they have Windows operating system, Visual Studio installed on it, Visual Studio Code installed on it. Then they took, they captured that image. Then I can then use that image to create, 100 other virtual machines that have the same thing already installed. So an image is just a capture of an operating system and that we can use to create virtual machines.
So the same thing apply is the same thing like the VM template because he asks you what is the VM template as well.
I
So
really, I really like Gabriel's answer. So Gabriel's answer is that it's like the ISO file of the operating system. That's perfect. So essentially, that's it. It's like the ISO file of the operating system,
yeah,
that you can download from Microsoft or Ubuntu. So thanks very much for that, Gabriel. Okay, so let's move on to talk about that. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of the images. So one of the things to talk about is let's talk about virtual machine disks, Sir Kofi. So virtual machine disks. There are three types of disks that we talk about when we talk about virtual machines in Azure. So let's put this in the right order. Three types of disks that we talk about with virtual machines in Azure. What are those? The first type of disk is the operating system disk, OS disk. Sorry, OS disk. So this is the disk that has the operating system files, right? The Windows files, the files that are used to boot the operating system, that's where they're stored on the OS disk. So it's compulsory for every virtual machine to have an operating system disk because that's where the files that will be used to boot the operating system, that's where they're stored.
yeah.
Then we have the data disks. So the data disks are optional. So they are optional, you don't have to have them. So for example, I'm creating a virtual machine now. Let me go ahead and select the image. I'll just leave the current image that I have, which is the Ubuntu image. I'll just leave that. So, but if I go ahead and you can see that if I go to the disk section, so let me just go ahead and put this very quickly. So create new resource group, compute resource group. Okay, I'll call this my dev VM01. Each UX will come back to high availability later. I'll make that password. So I'll put the username and the password there. And let's verify that. Okay, so if I go ahead and go to under disks, so under the disk section over here, so you see that that's the operating system disk, right?
Yeah.
It said that's the operating system disk. However, on that data disk, it said you can choose to attach a new disk or an existing disk. So these are additional disks that we can add to a virtual machine in Azure. So those are optional, right? So, but there is another type of disks for virtual machines in Azure, which are called the temporary disks, temp disk. So let's quickly go back to our slide and let's go see what this is about before we move on. So virtual machine disk, we said operating system disks, which essentially I have a virtual machine that's running on an hypervisor in Azure. The virtual machine is going to need an operating system disk. The operating system disk is not going to be stored locally on the hardware that the virtual machine is running on. It's going to be stored in a storage cluster in Azure. So the operating system disk will be accessed by the virtual machine over the network, right? But this is high-speed connectivity that we're talking about. So it's not stored locally, it's stored on a storage cluster in Azure. So hopefully that makes sense. Then if I go to clear the screen, then we said we have a data disk. So data disks are additional disks that we can add to our virtual machine. How many data disks can we add to a virtual machine? Well, it depends on the size of the virtual machine that we selected, right? If, for example, if I scroll down here, you see that if I selected this virtual machine size, it said I can add 4 data disks. If I selected that size, I can add 32 data disks. So essentially, the more expensive the virtual machine is, the more number of data disks that you can add.
All right.
Yeah. So that's how that goes. So that's the data disk. So data disks are also stored on the Azure storage cluster and accessed over the network. So they are not stored locally on the compute that the virtual machine is running on. But what about these temporary disks, David? What is this about? So first of all, let me show you something. So Sir Kofi, earlier we were analyzing virtual machine sizes in Azure, and we said any virtual machine size that does not have S in the name does not support premium SSD, right? You remember that, Sir
Yeah,
Kofi?
that's right.
Yeah. However, have a look at this. Like, David, are you lying here? Because I can see here that this virtual machine size doesn't have any S in the name. And I can see here that it says I have a SSD of 75 gigs. What's going on there, David? It doesn't have any S in the name, but it has a SSD of 75 gig. That is what is referred to as the temporary disk. So this is where Microsoft goes, okay, you have your operating system disk, you have your data disk. There's a lot of storage locally on the system that the virtual machine is running on, right? What
Okay.
Microsoft will do is they're going to give us a slice of that disk for our virtual machine. And the disks are all SSDs. So that's why, even though your virtual machine size doesn't support an SSD, Microsoft will give you a slice of the disk for you to use as your temporary disk. Does that make sense?
That's right. Yeah,
So
that's pretty good.
the idea behind this though is that do not store anything that you cannot lose on that. Because if something happens and your virtual machine has to be moved from this host to
Yeah.
another host in Azure, that data could be lost.
What about reboot or deallocation? Does it
So
support? Does
So
it?
the allocation it will probably
Right. All
yeah,
right.
it will probably go. So with a reboot, it usually does not because you're
All
going to
right.
try to reboot it on the same host. So with a reboot, it usually does not. But again, there's no like guarantees or anything. So what you see, for example, is if I go back to my virtual machine that I'm running in Azure over here, if I go to this virtual machine and I go to the C directory, you see that I have temporary storage here. And that's SSD. If I double click on it, you see it says data loss warning. And it gave me a warning here. Let me make that bigger. It says, careful, 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 careful. Do not store anything important on here. Any data stored on this drive is subject to loss. There's no way to recover it. Do not use it for storing anything that's like that, because again, it could go and the storage could go if something happens. So, and they refer you to a documentation. So that's what the temporary disk is about for virtual machines. So one of the exam objectives that we have, Sakofi, is to encrypt our disk. So I'll go to show you how to encrypt a virtual machine disk, and then we'll see how much time we have left, take some more questions, and then we'll stop for today. Yeah, thanks very much for bringing that up, James. So that's true. So the swap file is also stored on the temporary disk. So and the swap file, because again, it's just faster storage, it's local, so it's going to be used for swap. So thanks for bringing that up, James. So that's sort of like the way that that works. So one of the objectives I mentioned that we have, if we go to where we started today with our exam objective, is to be able to configure Azure Disk Encryption. So because by default, disks are not encrypted. So how do we do that? So let me show you how to do that very quickly. So over here, I have this dev virtual machine. If I go to the left-hand side of this virtual machine, I have disks. Let's go to disk over here. And if I go to disk over here, you see that I've got a single operating system disk. I don't have any data disk or anything. So what I can do is I can click on additional settings over here, Sakofi. If I go to additional settings, and then you can see that it gives me the option to configure something called Azure Disk Encryption. And it says, what disk do you want to encrypt, David? Just the operating system or the operating system and data disk? You cannot encrypt data disk alone. You have to encrypt the operating system disk if you want to encrypt the data disk, but you can encrypt only the data disk if you want, sorry, only the operating system disk if you want to. So in this case, I'll select the option to encrypt the operating system disk. I'll need to go specify an Azure Key Vault resource that we can use to store the encryption key for this virtual machine. So I'll need to do that. So I'll need to be very, very quick with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that in that resource group. I'm going to call this DOVM encrypt. I'm going to put that, leave that in West Europe. I'm going to leave that as standard. I'm going to go under access policy, and I'm going to ensure that I have an access policy that allows Azure Disk Encryption. So I have to allow that. So I have to select that option to allow Azure Disk Encryption, and then I'm just going to create it. So that's going to create the key vault. So this is the key vault that's going to hold the key that's going to encrypt my VM disk. So the risk that we are trying to stop here, Sir Kofi, is the risk that someone could download the virtual machine disk from the Azure portal,
Yeah.
and then go to mount that virtual machine disk on another virtual machine and read the files on the disk. And that's a serious risk, right?
That's
Some
right.
organizations are hosting domain controllers on Azure. If someone is able to download the disk of your domain controller, they can extract the directory file, and then they can begin to try to extract the password hashes for your users. So we'll take questions in a few minutes because I think we're
We've
close
got a
to
few
rounding
of
up.
them, yeah.
Yep. Let me just quickly show this one and then we'll move on. So you see that it's asking me for a key. What is this about? What's the key going to be used for? So the way that that's going to work very quickly, Sir Kofi, let me quickly show you what it's doing in the back end. Is I'm going to have my virtual machine. And I'm going to be encrypting the disk of this virtual machine. So this disk is what I want to encrypt. So I'll just call it the D1 for disk 1 of this virtual machine. I have my Azure Key Vault resource, and my Azure Key Vault resource is going to need two keys. So the first key is going to be called KEK, or Key Encryption Key. What does that mean, David? So this is a key that's going to be used to encrypt another key. Is what this is about. So we're going to create a key encryption key in there. So we're going to have a key encryption key that's going to be used. So when I enable disk encryption for this virtual machine, it's going to encrypt this disk using a key. So which, if we're using Windows, is going to be a BitLocker encryption key. So that's going to be the BEK. So essentially, it's going to use this BitLocker encryption key to encrypt this disk, and then it's going to use this key encryption key to encrypt this key.
Okay.
So that's what's going on. So that's why it's like, okay, before we proceed over here, it says, David, I want you to give me the key that I'm going to use to encrypt the keys that will be used to encrypt the disk. Right. So that's what. So if I go to manage selected key vault, I'm just going to go quickly generate a key. And I'm going to call it disk KEK. So let's go to the key very quickly because of time, and then we just take questions for the rest. I'm just going to call it disk KEK for disk key encryption key. Specify the size. RSA is good. Go ahead and create that key. So it's going to generate the key in Key Vault. Then if I go back to my disk settings, and I may just need to go refresh, and then I'll be able to select this. So let's go refresh that. So once that's fully refreshed, I'll be able to select that key, and then that key is going to be used to encrypt the key that will be used to encrypt the disk. Come on. Because of time, and Sir Kofi has labs for us to do today that we'll talk about later. So apologies, it's taking me back out now. So let's go to disks. Come on, and let's go to additional settings. And additional settings, I'm going to go select my OS disk again, select my key vault. It's going to find my key. I'm going to select my key, right? And I'm just going to use the latest version of the key, and I'm going to click on save. So then it's going to begin the encryption process in the background, right? So that's what's going to do. The other advantage, very quickly, Sir Kofi, of this key encryption key is that some organizations have a requirement to ensure that they rotate their keys, maybe once every 6 months, for example, right? So if your organization have that sort of requirement to rotate your keys once every 6 months, this approach makes it simple because otherwise, if I have 500 virtual machines in Azure, they're all going to be having individual BitLocker encryption keys.
That's
Rotating
right.
500 keys is a pain, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to go rotate the BitLocker encryption key for this one and the key for that one. Whereas if all of them are encrypted with this key, all I have to do is once every 6 months, I go to rotate this key, and then I've met my requirement, right? So it makes it much more easier for me to meet those sort of things. So let's have questions for the rest, and then Sakofi will tell us the labs that we're going to be doing.
Yeah, sure. So let me bring this up. So when I install an application locally on a VM, is it stored on the temporary disk?
No, except you specify it too, which you should not do so. So it's not going to by default. Is most applications will try to install on the native local C volume if it's Windows. So keep it that way, or use the data disk, right? Because there's redundancy that's behind the OS disk and the data disk. They are backed by the redundancy of Azure storage, but not by default. However, you can switch and say I want to store it there, but don't do that. So
All right, let's move to the next one. Right. So when we delete a VM, will data disk will also get auto deleted or need to be deleted separately?
very good question. It depends on how you delete the virtual machine. If I go to delete a virtual machine directly from here, for example, if I go to under virtual machines in Azure and I go to delete a virtual machine, this way it's not going to delete the disk automatically. Right? I have to go delete the disk separately. Over here to my Linux VM and I say, let's go to delete that. So I'm just going to click on delete. And you see this action will permanently delete the virtual machine. Associated resources, disks, virtual networks will not be deleted. So if I delete it this way, it won't be deleted. However, if I go to delete the resource group, it's going to delete. If not, if the disk and all the other resources are in the same resource group, it's going to delete that. So that's the one. Okay. So next one.
All right. So for the next one, can we partition Linux OS mount points and custom partition types in Azure as the image are pre-built with OS partition and FS types?
So very good question. You can. So you can do that if you wanted to. So you can add additional disks, create new volumes. Essentially, so you can change that if you wanted to. Yeah, is the answer to that.
Okay.
So, and what you find out is that, so for example, like, have worked for a software vendor. So, Sakofi and myself used to work for a software vendor which has a Linux appliance on the Azure Marketplace, and the Linux appliance has, completely different, like partition type than, your normal Linux and stuff. So, that's possible. Okay.
All right, let's go to the next one. Right. So I know Azure Advisor recommend disk-based encryption. However, limitations which includes not being about to restore files or folders, only the entire VM. So,
Yeah.
what is your opinion on this?
Yeah, that's the truth. It's not matured up to that level yet. So, that's the truth on that. So, um, the advantage is that it has platform integration, makes it easy for us to configure encryption to enforce it using something like Azure Policy. Makes it easier for us to do that, but it has limitations like what you're talking about. So in some of those cases, it's either it's sort of like a balance of um, do you want to be able to apply this on a governance level using something like Azure Policy subscription wide, or do you want to implement, BitLocker encryption using a third-party service that you're using and manage it yourself? Which you can. You can do that. You can use third-party encryption services and carry on using that, which allows you to be able to do like individual file restores and other thing. So Azure Disk Encryption currently has that limitation, but it's sort of like the balance between. But yeah, no problems.
Okay, so the final question is this: why do load balancer public IP, front end IP show in the virtual machine public IP session?
Okay, very good point. So that's a different conversation with the network. So with Azure, so the way that public IP addresses work in Azure, it's a whole lot of story in itself. If I have a virtual machine in Azure and the virtual machine does not have a public IP, when the virtual machine is communicating with the internet, right? Microsoft has automatic translation using IP addresses that's not in the control of the customer. So they're just automatically going to translate your IP address to a public IP address that's not in your control when it's communicating to the internet. If you go and you attach a if you go and you attach if you go to attach, let me go there. You go to attach a public IP address to the network interface of this virtual machine. Then once you attach that, outbound flows from this virtual machine will begin to use this public IP address when for translation when they're going out to talk to the internet. The same thing goes if you have a load balancer and the load balancer has a public IP address and you have this load balancer and it has a public IP address, and then you've now attached this to a virtual machine that does not have a public IP address. So let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of a bunch of that. And so this is what you have. So what will happen is that, again, Microsoft will automatically ensure that outbound flows also are going to be translated to the IP address of this load balancer when they're going out to the internet. So the advantage of that is, as an organization, maybe you want to be a bit careful of your IP reputation. Maybe you're hosting services that needs to be recognizable, where people know that whenever they're seeing communication from this IP, it's coming from you. So you can have that load balancer, associate it with multiple instances in Azure, and that IP address of the load balancer will be used for the NAT translation as they go out to the internet. We've gone way over time, so apologies for that, but I thought that was worth explaining. And I think Gabriel has a nice comment. So he said, Vishal, if you created a storage account, no, otherwise, when you delete the VM. Yeah, thanks very much for that, Gabriel. That's a very, very good answer. Thanks very much for that.
All right. So thank you guys for joining. I can see that for today we had a very good audience, and the flow of the questions are so marvelous. We can see that people are really getting a lot from this, and the contribution is massive. So thank everyone, and thank you, Sir David, for these wonderful sessions once again.
I'm just trying to be like you, man. I just want to be like you.
All right, thank you very much. So we do have a lab session for today. So what Sir David have actually gone through, we have prepared a lab. I'm actually going to render the video now, so it should be ready in the next hour. So please do well to come back to the site, to our YouTube channel, and then go through the content as well. So it's just going to be about the virtual machine. So you have the ability to deploy the VM using the template as well, and also you actually use the VM skill set as well. And you can, I think there's another option, one that you probably will deploy it and add using extension. You will add web server to the server, the VM you deployed as well. So it's a very interesting one. So you should definitely take part in this lab. So we do have another session tomorrow for app service, and
Yeah.
I do believe Sir David will have another wonderful presentation for us. So do well to join us tomorrow as well. And once again, do thank everyone for joining us, and Sir David, thank you for a wonderful session.
Thanks very much, man. Again, hopefully I'll be like you one day. Thanks very much. Have a lovely
Thank
evening,
you, guys.
everyone. Yeah.
All right, bye.